and the Canadian Reform Conservative Alliance, both of which became the official opposition in the Canadian Parliament. Mr. Manning served as leader of the opposition from 1997 to 2000 and was also his party's critic for science and technology. Since retiring from Parliament in 2002, Mr. Manning continues to write, speak and teach on a variety of topics. He has also served as a senior fellow of the Canada West Foundation and as a distinguished visitor at the University of Calgary and University of Toronto. Mr. Manning is currently a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute and president and CEO of the newly formed Manning Centre for Building Democracy. The Manning Centre is a national not-for-profit organization designed to equip the next generation of political leaders with ideas, skills, and networks necessary to serve the best interests of Canadians. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Preston Manning, and I thank you.
Make sure my cell phone is off. I want to thank you for the invitation to be here in Canada for sponsoring this public session, Mayor Bernier for asking me to come as well, and just say that I'm really pleased to be here. Two characteristics of the Peace River country that I admire a lot is the pioneer can-do spirit, and also the willingness of people here to express their convictions in no uncertain terms without beating around the bush. It was those characteristics that actually made the Peace River country one of the first regions in the country that gave the Reform Party a hearing. And I always appreciate that, even though sometimes the strong opinions of our Peace River supporters would raise the eyebrows of people in other parts of the country. I remember being on a talk show here in Dawson Creek where the host got onto the subject of Senate reform. And I knew this was going to get us into trouble. He raised the question of what should be done with the old senators after the Senate was reformed. And I won't repeat to this polite audience some of the suggestions. They were colorful at best. One guy got on to we should give him a 21-gun salute, which sounded okay until he started describing the guns and where they should be pointed. So, in any event, the pioneer spirit and the openness and willingness to express concerns and positions, frankly, are admirable. They're essential characteristics to public discourse, and I'm sure that they will contribute to the usefulness of this conference. Now, the subject that I've been asked to speak about is reconciling community and energy industry interest in Northeast British Columbia. Let me repeat that again. Reconciling community and energy industry interest in Northeast British Columbia. And I'm happy to do so because reconciling diverse interests has been something I've thought a lot about and worked about quite a bit. I was in the consulting business before I got into politics, and a lot of my work involved trying to solve disputes between the energy industry and communities and Aboriginal people. And then, of course, I got into political business. And while many politicians start out their political careers as advocates of a particular position or particular interest, if you come from a rural constituency, you better be an advocate of agricultural interests, for example. But if you get elected, particularly if you become a part of a government, in the end of the day, your job becomes more how to reconcile diverse interests, how to reconcile agricultural interests with those of the consumers of agricultural products or with other sectors of the economy. And the difficult part in reconciling conflicting interests, it's never hard when all the good and all the right is on one side and all the bad and all the wrong is the other. Those are not the hard decisions or the hard things to sort out. The difficulties are is when there's good and right on both sides. Education is good, health is good, but how do you divide resources between the two? Agriculture and food is absolutely essential. Energy is essential too. How do you get the right balance between them? And just finding that equitable balance becomes the real challenge in reconciling a lot of these interests. Which brings me then to the community and energy interests of the Northeast British Columbia. Now, we saw from some of the early presentations today, and all of you know this, that there is an enormous and growing demand for energy in the world, in North America, and in Canada. And that applies there's a demand for energy that's derived from petroleum, from oil and gas, notwithstanding the environmental difficulties in that type of production, and notwithstanding the increased emphasis on renewable resources. Even if we were able to implement all the conservation measures that we know about practically today, and if we were able to accelerate the development of all the current practical renewable production of energy from renewable resources, the world demand for oil by the year 2020 would still be in excess of 80 million barrels a day, 80 million barrels a day. And the demand for natural gas would be about the 2/3 the energy equivalent of that. So, and it's that demand, of course, which ultimately drives the petroleum exploration development in northeast British Columbia as it does in other parts of the world. Now, the benefits of that development, and that's been discussed today, include the energy itself, the jobs, the economic activity, the tax revenues, the royalty revenues that flow to the province from it. But some of the community concerns that such development also generates range all the way from the ones we've seen today, from dust and noise and weeds, concerns about that, to concerns about environmental and health impacts, to conflicts with landowners, agricultural producers over land use, site maintenance, revenue sharing, and so forth. And tensions between landowners and industry are also compounded and heightened when there's incomplete information on either side, when there's mistrust on either side that prohibits dialogue, when there's a lack of a level playing field with respect to negotiation, and when there's a lack of capacity or resources, particularly on the part of landowners and communities, to represent their interests adequately. These benefits, these concerns, these conflicts, I pass over them quickly because others have mentioned them, are well known to you and have been or will be further articulated on by other speakers at this conference. But my task is to present you with some suggestions or some tools and approaches which hopefully will be helpful in reconciling to the maximum extent energy and community interests. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you some tools. So let me start with the importance of agreeing on the facts. If there's not agreement between the industry and the community on the facts surrounding an issue, whether it's the health impacts of a risk associated with sour gas, or facts with respect to split level tenure or flaring or whatever it is, if there's not agreement on the facts, there is unlikely to ever be agreement on a satisfactory approach to dealing with the concern. For example, in the early days in the petroleum industry in Alberta, there was a great deal of misunderstanding on the simple matter of who actually owned the resource. Some landowners also owned the subsurface rights under the old titles that were granted before Alberta became a province. And so other landowners assumed that they had the same. Well, it wasn't the same. Then there were land grants to the railways, some of which included mineral rights and some of which didn't include mineral rights. And then there was a shift in jurisdiction over natural resources, including lands, oil and gas, from the federal government to the provincial government, which was accomplished by a constitutional amendment in 1930. This was between Turner Valley, where it was under one system and under one jurisdiction, then the Duke after that under another system, all of which created misunderstanding and controversy over who actually owned what and by what authority. And it took years to clear up those misunderstandings and to get agreement on the facts concerning resource ownership in Alberta and the meaning of surface rights versus subsurface rights. And until that agreement on the facts occurred, it was almost impossible to address and resolve some of the conflicts between landowners and oil companies. Now, one way of getting agreement on the facts where it does not exist is, of course, through fact-finding hearings by regulatory tribunals and publications of the results. And sometimes, to say that's best done by a regulatory authority, and it's accepted by both sides. But sometimes it can be done by a more informal ad hoc body. I recall discussing the challenge of getting agreements on facts with one of the negotiators of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. This fellow's job was to try to get agreement on the trade sector part of the Free Trade Agreement. And he had both American and Canadian interests in the room. And he was getting nowhere in the discussion because there was no agreement on what the current levels of tariffs were, and particularly what the indirect tariff barriers were on machinery parts. And so rather than keep trying to get agreement when people didn't agree on facts, he stopped the whole discussion. And he said, "Who is getting agreement on the facts, either via regulatory hearings or more informal mechanism, and it's an important first step to reconciling a conflict between a community or between landowners and the energy industry. Who is getting agreement on the facts, either via regulatory hearings or more informal mechanism, and it's an important first step to reconciling a conflict between a community or between landowners and the energy industry." And then there's another important tool for reconciling conflicting interests, and I think we got a sample of this from Audrey of Q-Store at the lunch today, and that is the application of science and technology. Sometimes, not always, but the application of science and technology can address and mitigate a source of conflict between the community and the energy industry. And of course, the most frequent illustration of that has been given today in a number of the presentations, is that if multi-well drilling from single platforms, as compared with drilling the same number of wells from single platforms, actually reduces the number of roads and pipelines and incursions on the land base, then the adoption of that technology reduces rather than increases the conflict between landowners and the industry. Well, and I'm a great believer in the application of science and technology, I think it's also important to recognize that almost all technologies are two-edged swords. The new technology adopted to address one problem can create other problems, and these need to be anticipated and assessed. For example, the production of ethanol from biomass, a renewable resource, was intended to reduce our dependence on petroleum, a non-renewable resource. But depending on the source of the biomass, the adoption of this approach can also have negative and largely unanticipated effects on the price of food, especially in developing countries. And this is why it's recommended that whenever we talk about applying technology and science to solve a problem, that should be accompanied by a so-called EEELS assessment, an economic, environmental, ethical, legal, and social assessment of the implications of that technology before proceeding. So two questions worth asking and answering when there's a conflict between the community and an energy producer, energy industry, particularly over exploration and development or the environmental and health effects. Is there a scientific or technological answer to this problem? And if it appears there is, what are the environmental, ethical, economic, legal, and social implications of adopting that solution? Now let me turn to the role of government policy, regulation, and grassroots democracy in identifying and reconciling conflicting interests. Government policy and regulation, of course, have a role to play, since it's usually government policy and regulation that creates the framework within which community and industry interests play. And governments also have a vested interest in both the well-being of the community and in the revenues and economic activity from the industry, and thus an interest in balancing the two. Often when you have a vested interest in two sides, you've got a real interest in balancing the two, because you want them both. This is the Canadian way, at least a decade. You know, when we're presented with a big decision, we always say, why can't we do both? Why do the Canadians cross the road to get to the middle? Why do people live in Winnipeg? Because it's a long way from the edge. That's I don't have to get votes in Winnipeg anymore, so I can say that. Now, no doubt Minister Lekstrom, who is here, is going to be talking about this subject tomorrow. But as I understand it, the policy of the BC government is to support and encourage the development of both the agricultural and energy resources of Peace River country. And the government's also responsible for maintaining and improving the regulatory regime represented by the Oil and Gas Commission and by the Mediation Arbitration Board. One of the tests of the adequacy of government policy and regulation in reconciling interests is the extent to which the community and the industry have adequate input into public policies and regulations and an ability to influence it. In other words, how open and democratic and responsive is the policy-making and regulatory process? Now, you're much better able to answer this question than I am, but it seems to me as an outside observer, and from what I've seen from the presentations today, that progress has been made in this area. As I understand it, one of the early landowner concerns here, because I think the original development here was mainly on Crown land, but then it shifted now to more to private land. And one of the early concerns was, in fact, it was expressed on this video, was when and by whom and on what terms had the surface rights been allocated. But through the advocacy work of the landowners groups, the Ranchers Association, the grain growers, the custodians of the Peace Country, and the advisory council that you have, the government was made aware of that problem, and that led to the current pre-tender notification system. So input on a problem resulted in some action that mitigates it. And I think the same thing happened with respect to developing a protocol between the Oil and Gas Commission and the Mediation Arbitration Board that requires the need for facilities on affected lands to be demonstrated before compensation is adjudicated. So I see progress. It may not be fast enough for everybody, but I see progress in changes in government policy and regulation in response to input from the communities and the industry. On the other hand, if you're dissatisfied with some aspects of government policy and regulation, or with the pace of progress being made, and no doubt there are people that are dissatisfied, I'd suggest you have only two choices. One is to throw your hands up in despair and accept the status quo and say there's nothing we as citizens can do to change things. That attitude bothers me because when people say that, they're really giving up on democratic process, and that's a dangerous thing. And particularly when adults convey it to their children, there's nothing we can do. All this freedom of God, it's not worth anything. You say that, repeat that often enough, particularly to kids, they'll start to believe it. Which may be why 18 to 24-year-olds are voting at less than 20% in some of our elections. Or we can say, we can resolve to work for changes in public policy and laws by skillfully employing the tools that democracy gives to us all. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to persuade somebody to support this and to oppose that. And why do I believe in the power of small groups to change public policy by democratic means? Because I've experienced it. And some of you in this room were part of that experience with me. In 1987, 5 people met in a small room in Calgary and said, we're going to make budget balancing an issue for every confounded government in the country. At a time when budget balancing wasn't even showing up in the polls as a public concern. And we said also we're going to do it by employing democratic means. And that's exactly what was done. We got the facts and arguments about the dangers of continuously overspending. We got it mainly from the think tanks and academics. And most of it was free. We didn't have to pay anybody for it. This research was done a long time ago and available to everybody. We created and formed alliances with interest groups. Taxpayer Federation came out of all of that. We formed a loose coalition of interest who shared the same goals. We printed and distributed a cheap news sheet. We distributed millions of copies of a news sheet that said if you're in a hole, stop digging, and showed the debt hole that Canada was in. We raised money. We didn't have any money to start with at all. We raised small amounts of money from large numbers of people. That's how you have to do it in a democratic system. We supported and found candidates for public office. We committed to budget balancing. Went to every public meeting where they were nominating somebody and asked the question, are you or are you not committed to balancing budget? These are things that anybody can do. And we did it all over the country. And within 10 years, every senior government in the country was at least nominally committed to balancing its budget. Even Ottawa managed to get its budget balanced by 1998. Now, don't let me get into what happened since then, because that would do another subject. But my point is that public policy can be influenced and changed by skillful, informed, consistent, democratic grassroots action. And to teach people the skills that are needed to do that and restore people's faith in their capacity to achieve democratic change is the main mission of this Center for Building Democracy that I spend most of my time on. Now, 2 further thoughts with respect to community, industry, government dialogue and relations. First thought, I personally believe that governments and industry should more strongly encourage open public discussion of issues and conflicts, in particular the most troublesome ones, rather than fearing that kind of discussion or discouraging it. If you fear that having an open public meeting to discuss a problem, particularly a controversial one, will get out of hand, or some wingnut will get up and dominate the meeting, and the media that'll be the headline next day, because controversy is always more newsworthy than constructive discussion. If those are the fears, then though that can be handled. Like, there is an art and a science of democratic discourse. There are ways of managing and holding open public discussion where that sort of thing can be handled, where the real issues can get out, and where the community itself will moderate its own extremes. And I've seen this done. I've done it. I learned it the hard way by making all kinds of mistakes. Reform in the 1997 federal election. You know how elections always start with the politicians saying, this election is about, this is a formula, it's always used. Well, we had to do novel stuff mainly to get the media to pay attention to it. So we had meetings at the beginning of the 1997 election where we had open meetings where we asked the public, what do you think this election is about? And we had an open mic, we passed it around the meeting. Of course, it was like playing Russian roulette. We had no idea what was going to happen. And of course, the media loved it because they were sure it would be a disaster. But you learn to manage those kind of meetings. You learn, and the rank and file of people eventually will say things, sensible things, and what their real concerns are, and they'll say them with passion. And if some idiot gets up and gets this discussion off, they'll boo him down. Like, the open democratic discussion works. And it's preferable, because the alternative is to avoid or suppress open discussion of the real problems and grievances. And when you do that, what you do is drive them underground. And you build up pressure, and they will boil up, and they'll boil up, and they'll boil out at the worst possible time. And the situation will be worse than in the beginning. Those of you in the gas business know this better than me. I was talking to Andrew Dale and Michelle just to get my story straight on this. But if you have a dangerous build-up pressure in the gas well, don't you try to find some way to vent it. Sometimes you drill a relief well to take the pressure off. You don't just screw the platform down tighter and tighter, or you'll blow the whole thing sky high. Well, that same principle applies to government, industry, community relations, with properly conducted democratic discourse providing the vent that prevents explosions later on. The second thought is with respect to getting governments to do the things you want done. I have seen hundreds of briefs to governments. The provincial, my dad was in Alberta legislature for 33 years. When I was a kid, he had a little office beside his office that I used to do my homework in. And he sometimes, in those days, the Alberta government met with every confounded interest group in the province before the legislature. The government was a little smaller then. And he used to leave the door open a crack, and he says, if you listen hard, you will hear the sound of the grinding of an axe, which was what was going on with each interest group that came in to see the government. But I've seen many briefs to government. I just saw one the other day by a business group concerned about increasing the competitiveness of Canadian industry. And what it consisted of was, although it was put together private enterprise guys, it consisted of 32 recommendations, all of which said the government should do this, the government should do that, the government should do that. What is far more effective in my experience, and I think the minister will bear me out on this in trying to persuade a caucus to support something, is when the community or interest groups go to the government and say, here is what we are already doing, and here is what we intend to do. Would you do this to support and assist and enable us to succeed? That kind of representation to government goes a lot further than a list that is just entirely expecting the government to do everything. Which brings us then to the acceptance of corporate and community responsibility for problem solving and conflict resolution. Problems don't get solved and conflicts don't get resolved unless there's an acceptance of responsibility by all the various players involved, in particular the frontline companies and the communities involved. What does acceptance of responsibility in this area mean from a corporate standpoint? Well, we just heard from Mike and from in Canada that it's a conception of corporate responsibility includes the value it places on trust and accountability, the support of community priorities, ongoing dialogue, the earlier the better, and a very high value on safety. And every company's different. I think communities should understand it. People that think all the oil companies and all the gas companies are the same, particularly on this issue of corporate responsibility or how they deal with communities, that's not the case. But it's not surprising that Encana would say some of these things, because if you look at Encana's roots, and sometimes it's very important to look at the roots of a company. Where did it come from in the first place? Because often its roots determine its values, and they determine values a long way down the road. In American law, especially utility law, there's a concept of private property, private enterprise, and private companies vested with a public interest, which suggests that even private companies are not just serving their shareholders' interests, but they're also serving some public interest that often is defined in law. Not much of that concept has ever got into Canada, except to some extent in Alberta and BC. And Canada, as some of you will remember, was created by the uniting of two companies, Alberta Energy and Pan-Canadian Resources. And what was Alberta Energy? It was a company formed in 1970, not just by private investors, but on the initiative of the Alberta government, which had a huge stake in it originally, and out of a public concern for lessening Canadian dependence on foreign oil. That's where Alberta Energy came from. It had a mission that was related to public policy as much as it did to earning a return on its capital for its shareholders. And where did Pan-Canadian come from? Pan-Canadian was the company that acquired the mineral rights that were originally granted to the CPI. That's where Pan-Canadian came from. And why were those rights granted to the CPI? To help it make money? Sure, it had to pay for itself, but also for a public purpose, namely to build a railway that opened up the settlement of the West. So when Encana reflects on its roots, its corporate responsibilities include both responsibility to shareholders and responsibility to publics, and that should reflect itself in its activity. And my experience, if you want to talk to a company about corporate responsibility, don't just look at the current material that they have on that subject, although that's important. Look at their roots, because you will find their values in their roots. If you can connect your argument to those values, they resonate a lot better than if you don't take them into account. Now, what does acceptance of responsibility for problem solving and conflict resolution mean from a community standpoint? It seems to me that it includes the developing and supporting spokespersons who can articulate your concerns, developing organizations, and I think you have some of them. You have landowner associations, you have the custodians of the Peace Country Society, you have this advisory council, and it seems to me that you're doing things that indicate an acceptance of responsibility to articulate your concerns and to press them upon the government and the companies. But one area of community responsibility which I know you have addressed, but which cannot be overemphasized, is for community leaders to make abundantly clear by public statements and community-backed resolutions that the community is committed to the peaceful reconciliation of conflicting interests and opposed to the use of violence to draw attention to those concerns. The violent protest or violent reaction is not only morally wrong, and someone's eventually going to get injured or killed if the bombings of facilities persist. And there'll no doubt be some innocent person just doing their job. That's the way these things turn out. But violent protest in Canada is not only, in my judgment, is morally wrong, it's usually counterproductive politically. It turns the Canadian public against the protester and his or her cause, and can easily provoke a strong negative reaction the other way. Some of the older folk here will remember the FLQ crisis in Quebec 40 years ago, 1970, when some protesters tried to draw attention to their desire for the independence of Quebec by blowing up mailboxes and eventually by kidnapping and killing a public official. The net effect was not to win support for that cause, but to turn the great mass of Canadians against it in a way they'd never been against it before. The violence led to a reaction in the opposite direction, the invoking of the War Measures Act with full public support, which vastly restricted rather than enhanced the political freedom of Quebecers and others at that particular time. The violence produced a reaction. I mean, There's no accident that in our Constitution, one of the few value statements is that Canadians are committed to peace, order, and good government. And you go against that, and you get a reaction. Sometimes the reaction can go too far. They now think that the War Makers Act was trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. But at the time, Canadians supported it 70 or 80%. And it was actually invoked by a leader from Quebec itself. There is, so anyway, that's my point on community responsibility. If one rejects violence as the means of addressing and reconciling serious conflicts, then what are the peaceful alternatives? One, of course, is judicial mediation, turning the disputes over to the lawyers and the courts. And sometimes this is the only alternative when all other means have been exhausted. But as many of you know, it is expensive, it is time-consuming, and the worst thing about it is it creates winners and losers, which can poison community and corporate relations for decades. I've seen people, I've seen companies, I've seen communities, I've seen interest groups that have won in court, but they lost everything else outside because they poisoned the relationship. The court can rarely do anything else. It's got to decide one or the other. And when it does that, say it creates winners and losers, it does not heal the relationship. There is another form of mediation, much less formal and much more community-based, which leads to out-of-court resolution of disputes, and this is how it works. Sometimes, but not always, but sometimes, there will be an individual or an organization in a community who is uniquely qualified to work with both sides to a dispute. Someone who can intimately identify with, in this case, let's say the landowners and the farmers, maybe because they've been one, or their dad was one, or whatever, but who can also identify with the resource company, again, perhaps because they worked with one, or they had some connection, or whatever. This unique type of mediator actually internalizes the conflict within themselves, and is thus able and willing to identify and communicate effectively with both sides and explain the positions of each to the other. These kinds of mediators are often misunderstood by each side, particularly at the beginning. The landowners think he's in cahoots with the company, and the company thinks he's in cahoots with the landowner. And so this type of mediator needs to be personally committed to resolving the dispute that he or she is willing to sacrifice his interests or reputation for. But if there happens to be someone or some organization in your midst with that kind of position, and that kind of mindset, and that kind of relationship with parties to a dispute, no matter what they are, those people, in my judgment, are worth their weight in gold. If you got them in the community, you have got something very valuable. Why do I even mention this type of mediation? Because I have seen it work on rare occasions in the Alberta oil patch, and the reconciliation it achieves is of a higher quality than any reconciliation accomplished by judicial decision. For example, there's a scientist I know, he's a biologist, expert on water, who does most of his work for companies with oil sand interests, and often testifies for them on technical matters about water before regulatory tribunals. If you looked at his resume, you'd say, well, this is a company guy. He gets his income from the companies. Most of the assignments he's got have been from the companies. They're on technical matters, but it's kind of substantiate their approach to using water or trying to correct it. But for some way, I don't know how this came about. This scientist also got to know and respect a particular family, who a few years after he got to know them, it turns out they owned a piece of farmland right next to the proposed site for a big upgrade. And they asked him to represent them at the regulatory hearing. There was a water issue involved in it. Now, and he agreed to do it. He agreed to do it. He had some relation with this family, liked this family, understood their concern. He agreed to do it. By doing so, he jeopardized his prospects for ever doing work for the company again. And no doubt there were those who counseled the family that they shouldn't trust this guy because he's one of those company scientists. In other words, he ran the risk of being suspected and rejected by both sides. But instead, because of the way he conducted himself, and he conducted himself at the hearing, he eventually ended up commanding the respect of both the parties and the regulators. Instead of simply criticizing the proponent of the upgrade, he focused on one area where no one could deny the evidence, that the construction of a large upgrader next to a farm on land that had been owned by a family for generations would generate stress. He asked the regulatory audience, is there anybody who disagrees that if you got a family farm and somebody built a big upgrader right next door, that it wouldn't create stress? I mean, you can't answer that and say, no, it creates stress. But then he proceeded to propose a list of practical things that the company could do to alleviate the stress. From biomonitoring and measuring of fugitive emissions to better control of flaring, risk management controls, there's a whole list of things, I don't remember them now. And because he knew the company, and he knew what they'd done elsewhere, this is where his being on the other side helped. Every mitigation and stress relieving measure that he proposed was something the company had previously agreed to and instituted somewhere else. So no one could argue that these measures were either unworkable or unaffordable. When he was presenting the family case, the chair of the regulatory tribunal asked if the company or anybody else wanted to cross-examine. Nobody stood up. There was no point. They didn't disagree. There was no cross-examination. There was no big conflict in the hearing room. And the company simply agreed to implement the remedy measures that had been proposed. The rift between the company and the family farm was bridged when virtually every stress-creating problem they raised was at least acknowledged and addressed in some way. Now, this didn't result in a perfect solution, but what it did do was heal the relationship between a landowner and a company, and this unique mediator created enough common ground to allow further discussions and mediation to occur. These kinds of mediators cannot be parachuted into a company or a community or a conflict situation. They are already embedded there. They're already there if they exist at all, which is the key to their effectiveness. And the challenge is to find them and to support them in their reconciling role. And I challenge you to do that. Whenever you come up with particularly big conflicts, ones that can divide the community or split things up, is there somebody embedded there, goodness knows what their background is, but for some reason they've incorporated the dispute within themselves and can perform that role. They're worth their weight in gold. And so to summarize, some tools and approaches which hopefully will be helpful in reconciling to the maximum extent possible community and energy interests where they conflict in Northeast British Columbia, agreeing on the facts and getting agreement through fact-finding hearings and ad hoc groups, applying science and technology, remembering that technical solutions can be two-edged swords, appealing to government policy and regulation strongly influenced by open public democratic discourse on the issues and the concerns, accepting responsibility by the corporations and by the community, including the responsibility to resolve disputes by peaceful rather than coercive or violent means. And lastly, mediation, judicial mediation if necessary, but preferably out-of-court settlements enabled by mediators who identify with both sides. I'm confident, because of what I know about the people of the Peace River region and the principal resource developers that have been attracted to this region, that you will find a way to jointly and responsibly utilize both the agricultural resources and petroleum resources with which this region has been blessed. There are parts of the country that would give their eye teeth to what you people have. And they take all the problems if they can only get the resources. But I'm confident that you will be able to satisfactorily resolve any outstanding issues between you. And by doing so, you will be living up to the name by which this region is known to the world. Does not the Peace River, or Anchaga in the original Aboriginal tongue, derive from Peace Point near Lake Athabasca? And was not that the place where a treaty of peace was ratified for the smoking of a peace pipe, ending decades of hostility, including violent hostility, between the Beaver and the Creek? I wish you similar success in reconciling the community and industry interests of Northeast British Columbia. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. I believe we do have some questions, if the girls could run them down here. If Elaine is in the Audience, please, can you deliver the questions?
Would it not be more democratic to hear someone's voice and ask the question?
The speaker is open to that, so if we have a roving mic.
Sounds good.
Wait till he gets his. Give me a second. Okay?
I always say that unlike in the House of Commons, answers will be provided to the questions.
Thank you very much. I applaud very much your insistence on peace. And I think without making peace, the Canadian people are in big trouble. I personally and others have been involved with oil and gas companies for many years in the peace. And I remember a meeting with Gwen Morgan, who was then CEO of AEC, some years ago, many years ago actually. And I remember him saying, when there was great concern about flaring, personally said, we need, as a company, also to do something about this flaring, because many chemicals come off, benzenes, carcinogenic stuff, that, and I will make that a priority with this company. I drove to Dawson Creek today with some of my sons-in-law and saw not only flaring, open flaring, which is scientifically not necessary. That has been made known in many times. Big flares, black smoke coming off them. And I contend that it is very difficult to get companies to listen to the public, especially in times like when there has been a tremendous amount, I've spoken to people, when there has been a tremendous amount of coercion and pressure for them not to speak. And I'm not saying that's been necessarily done on purpose, Mr. Manning. But nevertheless, those conditions exist. And I agree with you 100% that a democracy is about also that wellhead that you talked about not blowing.
Yeah. You have a question there too, because I want to respond.
Yeah, my question
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
where is it? Why do we still see flares? Are they from in Canada? Why is something not being done on this? And it's not because there aren't committees. That's my question.
Yeah,
Why
okay,
is
now that's-
headway not being made
Yeah, no,
on
that's a
such
good question.
fundamental
Yeah.
issues?
Well, I'd say two things, and I'm not close and I can't speak for any company, and I can't speak for the industry, but I make 2 points in response to that. First of all, there is progress being made. It's not as fast as you would like, and maybe as fast as I would like, but if you do look at the amount of gas that's being flared now compared to what was done in the past, there is progress being made. Secondly, I would point, some of you saw the presentation at noon. Audrey had a slide with a whole bunch of reasons why flaring should be controlled. She was offering a particular technology for doing it. Some of the reasons were environmental ones. It would reduce the emissions, it would reduce the factors used. There was also a bullet point in there, is this would actually reduce the amount of waste gas that would be worth about $24 million in the case that you use to the industry. In making arguments with the companies, you can use your environmental and community concern, and it does resonate now, certainly a lot more than it did in the past, but also use the self-interest argument. There is a self-interest in companies in saving some of that gas. You know? So I think part of it is how we make the pitch. But I understand your concern, and there is some progress being made. It's not fast enough. I guess I'm just suggesting some ways that would make it fast. We in Alberta, of course, can hardly talk about this responsibly, nor can the federal government, because in the early days in Turner Valley was a naphtha field with mainly gas and just a little bit of oil. billions of cubic feet of gas were flared that hell's half acre that you could see and hear from Calgary out of Turner Valley, all under federal jurisdiction, I point out. But us Albertans can't lecture people on flaring. Okay, other questions? I'll try to be brief if you'll be brief.
Don't know what happened to Elaine's question.
Yep.
I work for an energy company, and I'm concerned about the environment as well. But one of the issues you mentioned regarding the mediation and maybe an unfolding of such a process and how that would actually be undertaken, I'd be interested in hearing your views on that. Good.
On how a particular type of mediation, or
How you would put together the process for something such as that between landowners and energy companies.
well, I guess there are the formal processes for mediation, the regulatory hearings. You've got your your mediation and board. There's the formal processes, and I did not mean to imply, and I hope I didn't do that, those formal processes can't be used. They have been used, and they can be effective. But I was maybe suggesting sometimes there are other more ad hoc methods. And this business of being able to find a mediator, it may be as simple as somebody who both knows the company and knows the landowner and got some kind of personal relationship. That sometimes those kind of out-of-court relationships they're far less expensive than the formal route. And I just say sometimes you can't find those, but I just like to have it on my list. Because it's interesting sometimes how you end up finding those types of people, and it's worth at least making the search. Well, I should tell you another story, but it's on this mediation theme. I used to do community development work up in north central Alberta, the Slave Lake region in north, and the Gulf Oil had a heavy oil experimental little pilot plant up there in Wabasca. It was an Aboriginal community, about 3,000 people, quite a remote community. And the relations were getting really tense between the band and the company was keeping what it was doing under wraps because it was a pilot project. They didn't want everybody and his dog to know what they were doing, particularly if they were getting any production or not. But this was leading to tension. So the guy that was in charge of the project, he was a principal guy, an engineer in Calgary. My one objection to him was that every fourth word was a swear word that came out of the guy. But apart from that, he was a great guy. And he said, we got to get a community relations person, someone to kind of mediate this. And what kind of person should we get? And he got suggestions from the different components of the company. And I was a consultant, so he got one from me. And the legal guys wanted to get someone they wanted a lawyer. They wanted someone that understood the treaty aid, and that understood the lease arrangement. They wanted, because this is a legal thing, we've got to have a legal guy. The PR guys wanted somebody that would look good on TV, explaining all of this to people. And there were several other suggestions. And I suggested this type of a mediator that I was talking about here. And someone that incorporated both sides. It couldn't just be someone from Calgary parachuted in there. And it couldn't just be an advocate from the community that had never dealt with engineers in Calgary. It had to be somebody. And I had a couple of people in mind. Anyway, I had a big meeting to say, we've got to decide what for the job description for this person. And I've got all these suggestions. So the lawyers, they want a lawyer. The PR guy wants... the PR people want a TV star, and Manning here wants us to go hire Jesus Christ. And his punchline was, so we'll take the candidates down to the Athabasca River, and the first one that can walk across is the one that we'll hire. But I at least had that on the list, and at the end of the day, they actually got someone that was closer to that, and I think that was an improvement over what they would have got out of it.
Mr. Manning, I appreciated your insight on the agreement on facts. My question is, can you offer any suggestions or some of your experiences when you can't nail an important fact down to the table and it remains something, a point of conflict?
Well, I raised that with these free trade negotiators because they ran into that. And this fellow's advice, and he did get agreement at the end of the day, he said if they can't agree on it, leave it off. If you leave it on and there's disagreement about it, you'll poison the whole relationship. By leaving it off, you may narrow the ground on which you can get agreement. But you're better to leave it off than to leave it on there and then poison the whole relationship. And sometimes, the other point that he made was, sometimes when there's a fact in dispute, if you just stick to the ones that you do agree on, you find the common ground, you build a better relationship, you get agreement on that, you can revisit that fact. And the attitudes of the players may have changed because of the agreement you got on the other facts. And I think that was pretty sound advice. Okay, we're weary because you've been doing this all day. So is there any last question? If not, I'll just thank you very much and wish you all the best in the rest of your conference.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. We generally give out speakers' gifts, but in a further effort to be sustainable and green, the organizing committee has chosen to put the budget allocated to the gifts to further educate a student. There will be a $1,000 scholarship awarded to a student who is enrolled in the Northern Lights Wind Turbine Maintenance Technician Program, and this is the first program in British Columbia and is a 10-month program beginning in February of 2010. However, we would like to give you a token of our appreciation. That's the mayor's pen. And with that it says, as Encanna said this morning, it's for signing checks. Anyway, Mr. Manning, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and to attend and take part in our energy conference. On behalf of the organizing committee, it has indeed been our pleasure. And to host you, and I extend again on their behalf, thank you and best wishes, and may you have a safe journey home. Thank you very much.